Good afternoon. I'm Warren Hogue, IPI Senior Advisor for External Relations, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this IPI Policy Forum, co-sponsored with the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, on the subject of protection of journalists and freedom of expression in the face of conflict. A brief note of housekeeping to begin. Please turn off your cell phones and other noise-making devices, except for those of you who would like to tweet this event, which we encourage you to do, by the way. In that case, keep them on, but just silence them. Our hashtag, by the way, is #ProtectJournalist, all one word, #ProtectJournalist. Sadly, our subject today could not be more timely. In 2014, by the count of Reporters Without Borders, at least 69 journalists were killed, 119 were kidnapped, and 178 imprisoned. And the group noted in its latest report, quote, "The murders are becoming more and more barbaric, and the number of abductions is growing rapidly, with those carrying them out seeking to prevent independent news coverage and deter scrutiny by the outside world." This subject is one that is once close and distant for me. Close because I covered the guerrilla wars in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua for the New York Times in the early 1980s, and I lost numbers of journalist friends and colleagues. In March of 1982, I spent a day working with a newly arrived four-man Dutch television team, and 2 days later, I had to write a front-page piece about all four had been gunned down, their bodies mutilated, when government troops intercepted them on their way to a rendezvous with rebels. Like the other acts mentioned by Reporters Without Borders, this was not a mindless act of violence. It had a purpose, and that was to prevent independent news coverage and deter scrutiny by the outside world. Many of us in the international press in Central America in those years had the experience of getting death threats on the phone or ominous warnings from government ministers of the dangers we faced, but we took comfort in the notion that no one would deliberately target a journalist and invite the scrutiny that that would bring. That's why I feel distant from the reality facing journalists today. When I returned to New York in the mid-'80s as the paper's foreign editor, I don't remember our wondering much about protecting our correspondents. Some of the steps we took then seem positively quaint now. Installing locks on office entrance doors, telling correspondents with identifiably Jewish names to keep them off their lobby mailboxes. When compared to the extensive efforts that news organizations like the Times must make now to provide security for writers and photographers, and most importantly, for local national staff. In short, there were no committees to protect journalists back then. There are so many new considerations and questions when it comes to the safety of journalists, and they lend real urgency to our conversation today. What training should journalists have? What security measures can news organizations put in place at a time when financial constraints limit their ability to maintain foreign bureaus? What is the responsibility of governments, some of which may have antagonistic relationships with journalists? How about international norm-setting organizations like the United Nations and NGOs, and how can they help? And what are the consequences of the explosion in the number of freelancers with no organizational identity or support? To take up these questions and others, we have a knowing and experienced panel, and since you have their full biographies in your papers, I will introduce them just briefly here in the order in which they will speak. Bård Glad Pedersen has been Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway since 2013. And among his responsibilities are security policy, humanitarian affairs, and human rights. Given the subject matter of today's session, I want to mention also that he has held several positions in the communications and press relations sector. David Kay was appointed the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right of opinion and expression, of the right to freedom of opinion and expression for the United Nations Human Rights Council this past August. Since 2012, he has been teaching international human rights law and humanitarian law and directing the International Justice Clinic, all at the University of California, Irvine. Dr. Agnès Calamard is the Director of Global Freedom of Expression and Information at Columbia University, and she has spent 9 years, and she spent 9 years as the Executive Director of Article 19, the London-based human rights organization promoting and defending freedom of expression and access to information globally. Judith Matloff was a staff foreign correspondent for 20 years, lastly as the Africa and Moscow bureau chief of the Christian Science Monitor, and she is now a professor at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism and has pioneered safety training for journalists around the world. She may have to leave a little bit early, and I mentioned that because I didn't want anybody to think she was leaving because of something somebody said. And finally, Matt Rosenberg is a foreign correspondent for the New York Times and previously for the Wall Street Journal and the Associated Press, and he covers Afghanistan, dividing his time between Kabul and Washington, though in conversation, Matt tells me it's more Washington now than it is Kabul. He was ordered expelled from the country in August for writing an article that the Hamid Karzai government considered, quote, divisive and contrary to the national interest, security, and stability of Afghanistan, unquote. But he is back there now, at least from time to time, and therein lies a story which should be universal for this conversation, which will be useful for this conversation. So, Minister, if you would start us off, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for attending today, and thank you IPI for hosting this event and this important debate and discussion. Last December, in Peshawar in Pakistan, 148 innocent people were killed in a school attack. 132 of them were children. In Syria, thousands of people have vanished without a trace. One of them, a 53-year-old writer and human rights activist, Samira Al-Khalil, has been missing since December 2013. In eastern Ukraine, the fighting continues, and more than 1 million people are displaced from their homes. How do I know this? I know this from journalists, from reporters, from press photographers, from all the people of the media. Journalists go where most people are unable or unwilling to go. They place themselves in dangerous situations in order to disclose wrongdoing, to shed light on atrocities, and to expose violations of human rights. It is precisely because of this important watchdog role that journalists and media workers are targeted. They are threatened and imprisoned, even killed, for doing their job. We used to believe that the primary threat to journalists was just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Not anymore. Now journalists are targeted because of, not despite of, their profession. Many of these attacks do not reach the headlines. Like when 2 unidentified gunmen in August last year stormed the offices of the independent news agency Online International News Network in Quetta in Pakistan. They shot dead Irshad Mastoi, the agency's bureau chief, and reporter in training Ghulam Rasool. Journalists are attacked for what they have written, silenced for what they have witnessed, or kidnapped for the leverage and global attention their capture may provide. The perpetrators, whether government officials, security forces, private entities, criminal organizations, or terrorist groups, do not want their illegal actions brought into the limelight. Some of the most dangerous countries for reporters are those that are or have been in situation of armed conflict. Syria has been leading the charts of deadliest countries for journalists the last years. However, the vast majority of attacks against journalists occur outside situations of armed conflict. 9 out of every 10 journalists killed are local reporters covering local issues. And for every journalist killed, many more are silenced. They are silenced because they criticize authorities, because they report on sensitive issues like corruption, organized crime, religion, or drug trafficking. And for those journalists, when the security environment heats up, these journalists cannot go home. They are at home doing their work. We do see increased international awareness of the need to ensure greater protection, and this is positive and necessary. The Security Council, the General Assembly, and the Human Rights Council have all condemned attacks against journalists and call upon states to act on their legal obligations. And in 2012, UNESCO developed the UN Plan of Action on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. It is now being implemented in 5 pilot countries: Iraq, Nepal, Pakistan, South Sudan, and Tunisia. Regional organizations have also taken important initiatives. The international legal framework is in place. What we need is a political will and implementation at the national level. The single most important cause of danger to journalists is impunity. Every act of violence that goes uninvestigated and unpunished is an open invitation for further violence, and ensuring accountability for attacks against journalists should therefore be our first step. States do have an obligation under international law to investigate and prosecute systematic attacks against journalists, and in situations of armed conflicts, journalists are considered civilians and thus protected by international humanitarian law. We therefore have to promote and enhance the respect for international law and standards on this area. The gap between commitments states have made and the respect shown for human rights in practice is far too big today. States must put in place a domestic legal framework that protects freedom of expression and journalists. They must investigate threats and attacks against journalists effectively and impartially. They must train the police and ensure that law enforcement authorities are independent. With freedom of expression and independent media being more important in our foreign policy, and should be that for more countries, we will intensify our efforts through more targeted actions on all levels. In bilateral consultations and meetings, we raise freedom of expression and the safety of journalists towards other governments. And we use the Universal Periodic Review in the Human Rights Council to raise awareness and to engage with other states on these issues. But I think that perhaps the most important part of what we can do is to support and to facilitate the work of media organizations and civil society. They play an important role in documenting and raising awareness about threats against journalists. They monitor dangerous environments, issue reports, and offer practical assistance when journalists are threatened. And in addition, they provide valuable training to journalists, including in situations of kidnapping and digital security. Freedom of expression and the safety of journalists are under pressure many places today around the world, and we need to do more to protect fundamental human rights and ensure safety for journalists. And that is the starting point for the discussion as I see it, and I'm looking forward to hearing the opening remarks and the comments from the other panelists, and not the least the questions from the audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to hold applause. We're always very polite here, but it's going to delay us, so I'll hold it at the end. We'll go right to David Kay.
Thank you so much. I want to start just by thanking IPI and the government of Norway for sponsoring this discussion, and to really single out the government of Norway for its support for freedom of expression and for human rights institutions at both the global, regional, and national level. We wish that all governments could be as supportive as yours. So I want to. And I very much appreciated those opening remarks, in part because, first, I fully agree that there's an ample international legal framework, and the questions really revolve, to my mind, around implementation. But what I want to do is sort of address the issues of today around kind of two headings, or under two headings. One is under the heading of rhetorical thoughtfulness, which might sound a little new agey, but it's not as much as it sounds. And then secondly, legal forethought. So first, let me talk about on the rhetorical side. So I think it's quite important to begin any conversation these days when we're talking about press freedom to note how abhorrent the attacks in Paris were. On both freedom of expression grounds and also, of course, for freedom of religious expression grounds, because not only were the attacks on Charlie Hebdo abhorrent, but so too was the attack on the kosher supermarket, which is, in a sense, the way in which religious Jews express their own observation. So starting there, I actually want to admit to a certain kind of discomfort at some of the rhetorical responses to the Charlie Hebdo massacre. So columnists and politicians afterwards wrote or spoke about how the cartoonists at Charlie Hebdo were partisans in a kind of war. Cartoonists were characterized often by other cartoonists in really striking cartoons as partisans deploying the weapon of ink instead of bullets or pens instead of guns. I don't know how others felt about this, but it made me think, first, these are great cartoons, but journalists and others in the media are not partisans. And I'm concerned, after Charlie Hebdo in particular, that we tend to think of them as partisans in a fight against, in that context, against terrorism. And I'm not sure that's really the way that we should be thinking about journalists. They don't deploy weapons, even rhetorically. I'd like us to get rid of that metaphor. It feeds and confirms, to my mind, the narrative of repressive governments and militant jihadists, both of which require an enemy for their survival and self-identity. So if I could make a plea, this is the rhetorical thoughtfulness, not the new agey rhetorical thoughtfulness part, which is let's try to get rid of that metaphor altogether and state clearly journalists are engaged in the thing at the heart of Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Universal Declaration. That is the protected right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers and regardless of median. Okay, so with that plea, to move away from that rhetorical or metaphorical model, I want to say something about the way in which states have reacted to Charlie Hebdo and the way I'm concerned about that reaction having implications for freedom of expression more generally. So again, I share everything that the Deputy Minister said at the outset, particularly our need to end impunity, to focus on protection of journalists at state and local levels around the world. But I think that it's also important for us to recognize that states in the West have reacted in ways that are at best understandable, but at worst real threats to freedom of expression. And even though they do not necessarily deal directly with the press, eventually all limitations on freedom of expression undermine a free press and the security of journalists. So let me just give a few examples of some of the steps that states have suggested or governments have either taken or suggested taking over the last 6 weeks or so. Some of this began even before Charlie Hebdo. So one, if I can focus on the French change in law. So they've increased the penalties for glorifying terrorism, which I think is a vague term that could lead to abuse and excessive discretion in authorities. It's also proposed an international framework that would make internet service providers responsible for the content that they host. I think these are both problems which I'll get to in a moment, or we can get to in more detail in the Q&A. On January 11th, the joint statement of a number of European home ministers and justice ministers singled out the internet as a principal enabler of hatred and violence and called for a quote-unquote partnership with service providers for, quote, swift reporting of material, end quote, and takedown of other offensive material. Canada introduced proposed legislation that would criminalize knowingly advocating or promoting terrorism offenses in general, not necessarily requiring the specifics of an attack to be mentioned. The United Kingdom and the United States are proposing tools to undermine online security, essentially to create backdoors into encryption that ultimately may erase communication security for journalists, for activists, and others who require it. So these are just a few of the examples. This is, and I don't mean to pick on particular countries, these are examples of legislation that I think we see around the world right now, and I think it should give us pause. Journalists and their sources depend upon the tools of anonymity and security to conduct their work, just like activists do. To the extent that some of these rules show real vagueness, for example, what does it mean to defend terrorism or to glorify it? We risk putting excessive discretion in state actors and ultimately perhaps undermining the security and protection of journalists. When will that discretion be used to undermine journalistic reporting? When will the example of this kind of legislation be used in repressive societies to really undermine and even detain journalists for their work? So I want to just conclude here by saying that the attacks in Paris and the ongoing problem of ISIS recruitment, for example, are real problems. I think it's important to acknowledge that they are real problems, and they're real problems deserving of targeted, significant responses, but I would strongly urge governments to avoid making freedom of expression a casualty of that response. So I'll end there, and I look forward to the Q&A afterwards.
David, thank you very much. Agnes?
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you again to the Norwegian MFA for all the support you've been providing freedom of expression for many years, including to Article 19, and indeed now Colombia initiative on freedom of expression. I was asked to reflect on a couple of key questions. The first one was to unpack maybe the reason why journalists have become increasingly direct targets of violence, and some of the possible remedies to the situation. So I may not get to everything, but I'm going to mention a few maybe a few issues that contextualize the violence against journalists. A year ago, in 2014, I think a number of observers, including myself, were noting the increasing, at the time it sounded more like political instability and political violence around the world. And I have to say, 1 year later, I think what we have seen is a very sharp increase in the level of and the nature of the violence, and what was some areas of violence then has almost become a generalized global phenomenon that involved, in many cases, what was just little skirmish has now become full-blown armed conflict. So that took place over a 12-month period, more or less. So we're living in a very restive world, and I see very little evidence of 2015 offering a more peaceful path towards 2016. The second characterization of that restlessness is that it escapes in many ways categorization or geography, and that was a little bit mentioned earlier. When I started working in the field of press freedom about 10 years ago, it was very clear that any peak in the increase of killings against journalists was linked to a peak in an armed conflict. You could make the correlation very clearly. Nowadays, you can't. And I think that's, and you mentioned it, and I think we really need to insist on that. Yes, armed conflict continue to kill more than they should, well, citizens and journalists, but that is not the full picture. So the categorization of violence has become far more fluid than we were used to. And with that, so as geography. So the victims of that violence defies the geography of where it's taking place. It is, what happened in Paris to me is an interesting example of a local issue that has become a global issue, that has really become global, and that has really become local by targeting specific individuals in Paris. So I think this is another characteristics of that context within which those killings are taking place. The violence against journalists tell us not only that the most dangerous place are not armed conflict, but so-called, countries on the path to democracy. They also tell us that there is a globalization of the terrorism phenomena, such as in Paris. It also tells us that impunity for crimes against journalists concern countries that are usually described as democratic. This is what CPJ is telling us. What our own research at Columbia shows us is that the vast majority of the legal violence against journalists is being prompted in and by countries where the rule by law is the norm rather than the rule of law. So what should be the protection what should be offering protection to journalists is actually creating an ecosystem in which legal violence, but also physical violence against journalists can prevail because of the nature of those laws, coupled with the fact that when a crime against journalists occurs, impunity flourishes. The third characteristic, I think, to contextualize a little bit more the violence against journalists is that the restlessness in the world are occurring against the background of what has been referred to and either a multipolarity or bipolarity in the making. I think people are not quite sure yet. And this competition is played out not only at the economic, political, or military levels, and it is played at those levels as well, and we have evidence of that every day, but it is also played out in the normative, ideological, and soft power levels. You can see the fight at the UN around, the rethinking about certain norms that we were taken for granted. And of course, in that context, information is at the heart of the recreation, I think, the reconstruction of the global system. And to me, this is the other maybe it's a bit high level, but I don't have any doubt that this is, to a large extent, may explain some of the dynamics that we are witnessing right now. Violence against journalists has become part of the reconstruction of this world, has become part of the wars that are going on, whether they are military, economic, or otherwise. So we've all commented at some point about the incredible mastering of communication that ISIS/Daesh has demonstrated. Clearly, they want to control their image and their communication in some ways or another. That's one example. The other example is that there has been a number of new global channels put out by Russia or China. Again, another attempt to control information. But increasingly as well, there is control over information coming in the country. And that's where all of the stuff around internet is particularly worrying to me, because this control over information and control over online information and the rhetoric around it is not only something that takes place in the usual countries such as China, but increasingly the rhetorics, the fear around information, the fear around internet, the description of internet as this arm for terrorism, I think is impregnated a lot of policy making and thinking, and is incredibly dangerous for journalists. It's part of creating that system where information, freedom of expression, and journalists become are perceived at the heart of that new system. Very quickly, in terms of some of the maybe tools or ways that the violence, whether legal or physical, against journalists can be addressed. First, I would like to refer you to a document that was produced in 2013. Every year, the special representative or rapporteurs on freedom of expression from the UN, the OSCE, the OAS, and the African Union come together to produce a joint declaration. And in that year, they produced a joint declaration on violence against journalists. And that declaration includes a number of recommendations to governments, most of which are unfortunately still very accurate, but and very pertinent. I'm just going to highlight 2 or 3 which are often forgotten. The first one is that in my experience and in other people's experience, the impunity that prevails at justice level is coming at the end of a process, and that before that impunity, you've had a failure of the police to investigate violence against journalists. And we need to replace far more emphasis on the investigation side. And so you will see, if you go back to this document, a number of emphasis on that particular part of the justice process. How is the investigation conducted? Who is conducting it? And what kind of evidence is being brought forward? I have looked in the past at some files of cases of violence against journalists, whether it's killings or torture or other things. They were so thin. You know, they were 1 page. Some of the witnesses were not even interviewed. And that is quite common for a lot of cases. So we really need to refocus a lot of emphasis on the police side of it. On the legal side of it, yes, the legal, in theory, the law is there, but there are still a few things that can be done. One is to demand that crimes against freedom of expression be given a specific weight in the legal system. That could mean an aggravating circumstances, for instance, which is used for hate crimes, could be used for freedom of expression crimes. It could definitely require special kind of investigation if there is any hint that freedom of expression or information was one of the primary motives behind the attack. I will not deal with the proper security measures because I think the last 2 panelists are going to do that, but I'm happy to return to some of the other proposals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Agnes. And now we'll go to Judith.
First of all, I want to thank the Norwegian mission for organizing this, and it's very heartening to see such a large audience, because obviously for us journalists, this is a huge issue, and it's great to see some solidarity here. I've been asked to talk about freelancers, who are one of the most endangered groups. And actually, the reason why I have to dash is a new initiative is going to be announced at Columbia University, where I teach this afternoon. I have to rush back for that. And that's establishing new protocols for safety for freelancers internationally across the media. And if anybody wants to go there afterwards at 5:30 at university, it's open, and you can hear about what these new protocols are. And it really is an absolute critical phase at the moment, because the thing about freelancers is that with technology, which is mobile and makes it very easy to report anywhere at any time, 24 hours a day, anybody can be a journalist. And on social media, anybody can be a freelancer. In the old days, 30 years ago, when I started, you joined a media organization. You might freelance, but you could so easily get a job with a proper organized institution. And then you were mentored very slowly, and by the point that you had a mortgage and a family, normally they would send you to cover a war. But it was a very gradual, slow process of mentoring, and your organization had your back. And now, really, anybody can go out with a satellite phone, a cell phone, a tiny little camera, and start posting on YouTube, and voila, they're journalists. There's another thing which has also facilitated the rise of freelance journalism, which is the collapse of foreign bureaus in established media. I remember when I worked as a bureau chief in Moscow, there were, apart from my newspaper, which was Boston-based, there were 8 other American major newspapers that had full-time bureaus. At this point, I believe only the New York Times and the Washington Post maybe do. These bureaus don't exist anymore. I remember also when I was starting out in my newspaper, we had something like 12 or 15 FARO bureaus. I think at the moment they have 3. And who's filling the gap? It's young people, very much like my graduating graduate students, young people in their early, mid-20s who are just going out to Syria with no experience whatsoever. And you know, if you look at numerically how many of the journalists, aside from local journalists who are the most endangered group, if you look at the number of journalists, American journalists who were killed in Syria, nearly everyone was a freelancer who did not really have the backing of a large organization behind them. So I think that's one reason why we're seeing this problem. And I hope this new initiative that we're launching today, it won't cure it, but I think it might mitigate some of the problems. What we're looking for is signatories. We have major news organizations already signed up, like the New York Times is one of them, Associated Press, Reuters, and BBC. But what we also want are the smaller organizations that rely on freelancers. You know, large organizations like Matt, the New York Times, largely have staff people, and they're very well protected and taken care of. But it's the fly-by-night, the small undersourced organizations like Vice, like BuzzFeed, like the Christian Science Monitor. It's the smaller organizations that can only rely on freelancers, and they cannot take care of them properly, or they're unaware of what they could do to take care of them. I mean, a lot of it is, it's not that the editors are bad people. You know, I do quite a lot of freelance writing, and what I'm struck by is the editors who I'm dealing with, they're not bad people, they just don't know the questions to ask. They don't ask me if I have protocols because they don't know that there could be protocols. So part of this new initiative is to have an agreed upon industry-wide international protocol, get people to sign on, and then educate both the freelancers, because there are quite a lot of irresponsible people running around going to places they shouldn't be going to. So get them to realize what they should be doing, you know, what their part of the bargain is, and also educate editors so that they know the kind of questions to ask and be aware of what they could do. And it's just a first step, but I'm hopeful that it can save a couple more lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. And finally, Matt Rosenberg.
You know, I actually was honored. Oh, there we go. Wanted to speak a little bit what Judith said about kind of large organizations bringing people along, and you work your way up. Having been the guy who had to be grabbed by the collar and told to slow down, and then having been that guy who does that, it is amazing how things now seem obvious to me that I don't think even to a lot of editors are obvious. And it also speaks to how expensive this all is. And I'll run through our Kabul bureau, for example, as a little bit. So we have a physical bureau in Kabul that very luckily ended up within this kind of faux green zone that kind of got built up there over the years. We had rented the house in 2002. There are huge steel doors at the entrance. There are massive, these sandbag barriers called HESCO barriers. There's razor wire. And that's just the wall. Inside, you know, we've got a safe room, which has steel doors. I shouldn't get too much into, but some of this stuff's supposed to be private. There's just a lot of security there, and we don't have any armed security. If you live outside of where we live, you have to have armed security, which costs a few $1,000s a month on top of that. And you know, you start going through stuff. We have permanent staff. The thing is we're really lucky. We're there all the time. When you hire people who you work with, you trust them, you build relationships, but that's a salary you have to pay. That's a car you have to maintain. And that costs a lot of money, and most news organizations simply cannot afford it. You know, and that all, but when you do that, it kind of produces a series of better outcomes, I guess, and better practices. You know, we have a permanent security advisor. If we're gonna take a trip somewhere, you know, we like to kind of have the approach that our security advisor is not a security chief like many aid organizations that have. He doesn't get to make decisions. The inmates run the asylum, and we very much get to say, we're going there, he can provide advice. And we kind of would always work with this idea that we can go anywhere we want, and then we'd work it backwards. Now, often we couldn't, but we try, and you know, you plan the trip, you talk about where you're going, you have all this stuff planned out and people keeping track of you, so if something does go wrong, they at least know where to start looking, which is a big part of this. But this, again, all cost, that's a salary, you know, it's a lot of salaries in the end. And there are some things, you know, I think every journalist can do, but it does obviously keep costing money. Cybersecurity is something that journalists I think journalists in the West are now thinking about, and we have to protect ourselves from the NSA. You don't realize a lot of governments have very good, they call signal intelligence capabilities. The Pakistanis are wonderful at it. And many are, and you can protect yourself. You can get encrypted cloud storage. You can find very easily encrypted communication platforms that the NSA can probably break into pretty easily, but a lot of governments can't. And just that basic idea of security is, I think a lot of people have internalized, look, you're never going to be 100% safe. You're going to a war zone. There's an inherent danger that cannot be overcome. But it's a bit like when you kind of secure your house. If you live in a dangerous block, you put up some metal bars and you get an alarm system, and you just don't make yourself an easy target. You try and make it easier to go after somebody else. And I think a lot of journalists who are going off to conflict zones don't fully understand that a lot of this is about common sense, dress right. If you're going to a place like Syria, don't wear obvious camouflage cargo pants. You're going to look like you're in the military. You'd be amazed what people show up in. Really amazed. Or don't wear high heels or dress shoes, or one of those little wheelie suitcases, a lot of these common sense things can really save lives. And then, if you're going somewhere dangerous and you're a freelancer or you're part of a small organization, look, the other journalists around you, you're going to know them. It's a small community in these places. Talk to one of them, tell them where you're going, let them know, have a check-in schedule. There's also, if there's a good cell data signal, like a mobile data signal, there's wonderful available software, Find Friends on your phone. It's really easy to use. You can keep track of your friend anywhere in the world. I can pull it up on my phone right now and find out where like 5 of my colleagues are somewhere in Asia. It's a little weird, but this stuff's really, it's out there, and I think journalists have to kind of get better about recognizing the fact that, look, we're targets. There's no way around this, and we're very easy targets. And I found that out even when you work for a big organization like the New York Times, how vulnerable you really are. When I was being thrown out of Afghanistan, initially the government there wanted to throw me in jail, and thankfully, the New York Times State Department gets on the phone. The ambassador goes in and starts reading riot acts to the president of the country. But here's the thing. If that hadn't worked, they were throwing me in jail. There's no way around it. And you are incredibly vulnerable. Now, if you're from a small organization in a country far off the news, somebody wants to have you shot, you're probably there's a good chance you're going to get shot. You need to be able to protect yourself. And I think it's something journalists really are still kind of come to grips with and thinking about.
Okay, Matt, thank you. Thank you all. We've got one additional speaker, and this could not be more timely. You may have heard that today, or you know that there were 3 journalists from Al Jazeera arrested and imprisoned in Cairo. One of them last month was released, Peter Grest, and went home to Australia. The other 2 were in prison and were supposed to stand trial today, but instead we learned this morning they were released and held on bail. Gabriel Elizondo is here from Al Jazeera. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Thanks. Hello, good afternoon, good morning, how are you?
Gabriel, hold it very close to your mouth.
Yeah, thanks. I'm a TV journalist, but I'm supposed to hold this to my mouth, you say? So first, want to thank the mission from Norway, and also IPI. Thank you very much for this panel. It's been interesting. I come bearing good news and bad news, actually. The good news is that 2 of our journalists that were still being held in Cairo, we found out today, did get granted bail, so they should be coming out of jail here in the next few hours. The last time I checked was about 3 hours ago, and they hadn't been released yet, so that's the good news. The bad news is that they are not quite free yet. They have another hearing in front of this judge, and it's going to take place on February 23rd. So while they'll be out of jail, they cannot leave Egypt. One is an Egyptian citizen, the other holds dual Egyptian and Canadian citizenship. So they are essentially free, but not free. And so the story is that, the way Al Jazeera put out a statement a few hours ago, and I'll just read it to you, and you can, rather than me interpreting it, you can make up your own minds about it. But it says, bail is a small step in the right direction and allows Bahar Mohammed and Mohammed Fahmy to spend time with their families after 411 days apart. They were arrested in December of 2013 from their hotel, Marriott Hotel in Cairo, by the Egyptian security officials. The statement from Al Jazeera goes on. The focus, though, and this is the key part, is still on the court reaching the correct verdict at the next hearing on February 23rd by dismissing this absurd case and releasing both of these fine journalists unconditionally. And that's where really Al Jazeera still stands on the issue. We still very much want our journalists to be completely free from these really what we consider to be absolutely absurd charges that they were thrown in jail for, reporting quote-unquote false news, something that we have rejected from day one. So I thank everybody that has been part of this campaign over the last 411 days. Can you imagine 400? What have you done in the last 411 days? How many dinners have you had with your spouses? How many times have you hugged your kids? How many sunsets have you seen? Our colleagues haven't seen that, and now they're going to see it now for the first time. And for Mohammed Fahmy, he's going to be able to go to a hospital to get his shoulder checked out that was been permanently damaged while he was in prison and hasn't been able to have it checked out properly. And for Baham Mohammed, he's going to be able to see his child that was born. So, born while he was in prison for the first time, one of three, his child. So I want to thank everyone that has supported us so far, but I encourage you to, in all of your quarters and all of your interactions, please keep up this fight. Like I said, it is not over. It's far from over. And I encourage you to continue with this fight with us, as have Barack Obama, Ban Ki-moon, Samantha Power, Tony Abbott, and William Hague, just to name a few, who have all called for in the last year for our journalists to be released. We thank you for the support, and now turn it over because I'm sure you have a lot of questions for the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. I'd like to get questions now. If you would raise your hand, wait for the microphone to reach you, and as I told Gabriel unnecessarily, you've got to hold it very close to your mouth because of our sound system here. Start. I see Bill Blakemore in the back. Anybody else here in the front? And the third? Okay, we'll start with Bill, number one, and then number two.
Foreign correspondents who covered the opening years of the Beirut Civil War, 1975 to 78, based in the Commodore Hotel mostly, which I did for ABC News and for the Christian Science Monitor. Believe it or not, we had T-shirts made up and jackets made up that had the word in Arabic, Sahafi, written on the front and the back. Because for those first 3 years of that conflict, we were treated by all of the many different factions in that war as referees, and we could count on that safety. And on a number of occasions, we know anecdotes in which that worked. That had pretty much evaporated by about 1980, and then soon were being seized as hostages and eventually shot at. My question for the panel is two parts. Concerning the past, was there something that happened in world media or something, do you think, in the late 70s that meant that that sense of our profession as a trusted referee evaporated, or is it something that happens cyclically when such professional reporters go from being trusted to being targets? And the second half of the question is about the present and the future. Is it possible that our profession, as opposed to our occupation, our profession as an international profession, is not yet defined clearly enough for everybody to have a general agreement about why Article 19 is deserved?
Bill, I think actually we'll stay with that question because there are a number of questions there. By the way, I mentioned the quaintness of what we used to do 30 years ago. In El Salvador, we had shirts that said in Spanish, "I am a journalist, don't shoot." It was a joke back then. Let me ask members of the panel individually. Good, Judith, go ahead and grab some of what Bill suggested.
I think it's a really excellent question, what changed, and I think part of it is the geopolitical. We have a lot more small wars now. I think we used to have many more wars between actual powers. Now you have so many more militias, you have so many more rebellions, and with that comes chaos. I think and to me, everything has gotten worse with the internet because wars are being carried out along that too. It's another weapon. People have more access to information now, and information is power. So I think it's twofold. But I think the nature of conflict itself has changed, and therefore the role of a journalist in it is not as protected as it should be under the Geneva Convention. Not that it was fully protected, but I think that might be one reason why.
Board.
Thank you. I won't pretend to have the full answer, but one point I think is important is to see how propaganda is now an important part of any conflict, really. You can see that in eastern Ukraine, what is happening. You see that on how ISIL is using Twitter and internet in part of their propaganda wars, and journalists are threatening their ability to use propaganda to win the conflicts, and that is partly what is causing this danger. And I think it's really important that we do recognize that the main risk isn't accidents anymore; it is targeted attacks towards journalists just for being that, and preventing the propaganda from working.
Agnes?
Yeah, I wanted to be a bit more cautious, maybe, than the time-based study that have been made of violence in general demonstrate that we've never lived in a more so-called peaceful century, and I'm talking about the long 20th century. So for the data for the last 40 years have shown a steady decline of violence in the world. It's only for the last 2 years or so that those long-term predictions and long-term analysis are showing the beginning of a new peak. So I think whatever analysis we're making around the role of the journalist in the 70s as compared to now, I'm not convinced that this is directly linked to the increase in armed conflict. Because there has not been, except for the last 2 or 3 years, an actual demonstrated evidence-based increase in the number of armed conflict, whether small or big, only for the last 2 years. So I think it's far more linked to the nature of society, to even the nature of democratic processes, to a number of things. And I think it's largely linked as well to the transformation of the profession, the multiplication of journalists, the multiplication of citizen journalists, and the fact that power is absolutely granted, far more than it has ever been, on who controls information and communication. But I will not make a link between, at least comparing the 70s to now, I'm not sure that you can say that this is because there is more violence now that journalists are more targeted.
David?
Thank you. So I share those last sentiments, and I would only say, with respect to the last part of the question, sort of is the profession clearly defined, and so I think the rules are clearly defined. I think it's important to distinguish among the different types of attacks on journalists. Not all attacks on journalists are the same, right? So some, for example, the ISIS beheadings and others may be a form of attention grabbing, whereas some are almost penal, where governments are going after journalists specifically because of the work they're doing that might uncover information about governance. And I think those are different kinds of attacks, and I think that there's not really a one-size-fits-all approach that we can take to protection of journalists in any event, because the contexts may vary from place to place.
I'm going to get to you in a second, but I have a question of my own that arises from something that Agnes said about information coming in to a country. And I have in mind a speech by Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, last week in Munich, where he was laughed off stage by an international audience because of the utter fancifulness of the notion he put forth about what was really behind the Ukraine-Russia hostilities. I wonder if, particularly those of you who are academics, are you researching and studying the effectiveness of governments at keeping real information out and letting their own propagandistic version of events govern their own societies?
I think it's harder now with the internet. I mean, it's really hard to keep it out the way you used to be able to.
That's what I would imagine,
yeah.
But...
I mean, how do you stop YouTube from entering your country? I mean, people will try, but it's not...
You can just cut it off.
Yeah, I mean, that's, yeah, but you could then, yeah.
But I'm always amazed how in some countries, a lot of countries that are nominal democracies, the government says no YouTube, and all the internet service providers just shut it down.
Yeah.
And then there are ways around it. You get a VPN or something, but most people don't have it.
Yeah.
And then the worst thing is it starts spreading. Is so, let's say there's a video people find offensive up on YouTube, so they shut it down. But now the word's out, and it just gets, the theories get wilder and wilder. In some ways, it almost would be more helpful if everybody could just see the video and see it for what it was. But anyway,
Please.
Just one point is that even though information may be available, we know that if you're able to control national TV, propaganda is effective. You're able to drive the messages home. You could see the popularity of Putin in Russia. And obviously this propaganda has an impact, and it is a concern for countries with Russian-speaking minorities particularly, that they are subject to this propaganda, not because they're not available information otherwise, but because it works anyhow.
And yes?
I was exactly gonna say that. First of all, we need to remember that there are a large portion of the population in the world that don't access internet. Second of all, in many countries around the world, television remained the most, not here, but in other countries, television remained the most, the biggest source of information and opinion for the population. And Russia is a case in point. The government didn't go after internet until very recently. It focused exclusively on destroying independent television and independent radio, and to a lesser extent independent written press. So I think that information does always come in and out, but it doesn't mean that it reaches a big audience, or the audience that could use that information for, you know, political reform processes, for any other things. The second example, which also brings a more mitigated picture, is China. If a country is rich enough to invest into the firewall, actually it can control information coming in and out. Now, the problem, as the New York Times has well reported in recent weeks, are the long-term economic cost that this imposes on the country in terms of accessing to scientific information, accessing to a range of information that are not political at all, but that are about innovation, about economic, financial information. So there is a huge cost associated with that policy, but it's possible.
Very good. David?
So I would just add a few sort of side points to these. One, in terms of media, state propaganda. I mean, I think some governments have become very sophisticated at maintaining a veneer of independent media, but putting that independent media in the corner, sort of diminishing its voice, while sort of concentrating media in oligarchic hands or concentrating it in government hands. And that's a problem because at one level, it's just a much more sophisticated management of information. The second, taking off from what Agnes was saying, on the filtering tools, I think this is exactly right, that countries that are able to do this, they're stronger than we might think in terms of their ability to keep out information. Unfortunately, that's true, and that's true in part not just because of the filtering, but it's because of structural barriers. And so, I mean, those of us in this room should be thinking also about how to support places that they don't have information simply because extreme poverty, or maybe there's because of discrimination against women or against children, where the information doesn't get to specific communities. And I mean, I think those kinds of things play into these kinds of issues as well.
Thank you. Now I promised a question over here. I'll get a second.
Thank you. My name is Siopak. I'm from the Scan News. I'm from the Scan News. My question is what panel opinion about a weekend after the massacre in Paris, when there was a walk, and in the front of the line, there were countries that attended that solidarity walk, which included Russia, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel and Jordan. Those are the countries who actually abused journalism, but still they made a mockery and they came and then they were supporting freedom of speech and journalism. What do you think about this? And my other question is, I'm a correspondent. Whenever I go to a field to do the report, I know what's happening to me, and I get paid to do that. The publicity on me doesn't make a red light on my head and make me more wanted and more collectible for people to shoot me or to hurt me? Thank you.
Very good. Who would like to? Matt, do you want to take the second half of that question? Because that's your life.
I mean, yeah, it does. Sorry, there we go. Yeah, basically it does. You go out there and you're very visible. You know, you've got a byline or you've got a face on TV. People know who you are, and I mean, you know, there's the U.S. and the U.K. say, well, we don't pay ransoms as a policy or a legal matter because it would only encourage more. The Europeans, however, do, and I'm not going to make a statement one way or the other what we should or shouldn't do because I'll get in trouble with my bosses. But I know this much that out there, the people who are going to kidnap you and think they're going to get a lot of money, they probably don't know what the law in the U.S. is. They're probably completely unaware of it. And they do think you're an incredibly valuable target. And I know from experience with colleagues who've been kidnapped, the initial demands are often obscene amounts of money, thinking, you know, into the 8 figures that we're somehow going to come up with that. It's, you know, these are countries where $200,000 and $2 million, they're all inconceivable sums to most people. And I don't think they fully understand that money just isn't out there for most people.
Boy.
Thank you. The Norwegian Prime Minister and the Norwegian Foreign Minister are both in Paris marching for freedom of expression. And I too noted that not all the people in the march is first and foremost known for their track record on freedom of expression. And my thinking on this is the following. There is a huge gap between the commitments that nations have taken to protect freedom of expression and the reality that we see in several of those countries. And to an increasing extent, we see that countries actually advocate against freedom of expression, and that countries do cooperate between themselves to undermine the system, to protect freedom of expression and to protect freedom of media. What we need to do is to hold them accountable to the responsibilities that they have taken upon themselves to close that gap. And I think that anything that they do to make it easier to hold them to that account is good for me. But I fully see the irony of some of the people in that march. And when you edit pictures of a march that is for freedom of expression, I think that the irony has gone complete circle. But I think you need to recognize that freedom of expression are under an increasing pressure, and what we need to do is to build alliances to fight that pressure, and then we need to hold them accountable, and then anybody who marches for freedom of expression is good to me.
Please, here in the second row.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Kai Sauer. I'm the Finnish permanent representative, and I guess it was a relatively good morning both for Norway and Finland, seeing us heading the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index, which was published this year. Finland #1 for the 5th consecutive year, and Norway #2 with a very small margin, I have to say. In my question, I would like to go back to what the minister said about the hybrid warfare and the propaganda war in eastern Ukraine. Between the Western governments, there has been a lot of discussion how to counter this. What could be the antidote? Should we start our own offensive, media offensive? And my question to you, academics and professionals, does this make sense? Is this possible? Is it ethically sustainable? What is your opinion? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to? David, go ahead.
I think that's a very good question, and I think it's a question that applies across the board. Right? What can governments, what can the UN, what can funders do in the face of, real serious derogations from the freedom of expression? I'm sure that across this panel you get different ideas there. I mean, I think one thing that's really quite important right now in a place of armed conflict, a place where there's really a conflict between the legitimate media and propaganda, is to support independent media. I mean, that's one thing that I think outside donors can do, which is to ensure that local voices have access online, so they have access to information, and that they have access to ways to promote the information, to impart the information that they're finding. I mean, I think at a core level, the idea should be, let's make sure that there's competition with the propaganda. There are different ways to do that, but I think one thing is to really support through funding and through training of independent journalists in the field.
Agnes?
Yeah. I'm a strong believer that, notwithstanding the fact that we are living in an era where all wars, at some point, information wars, I'm a strong believer that the best way to respond to some of these propaganda or speeches must be through more speech rather than through censorship. So that plays at various levels. First, in terms of the struggle against so-called terrorism, I get quite worried when Western governments mostly push forward the instrument of censorship and repression, rather than to try to convince the heart and mind and to develop an actual effective communication strategy around our values and around, I mean, I'm not saying they don't do anything, but actually I don't think they do enough. So absolutely investing into the countering of some of the absolutist repressive voices that are coming is essential. And it's true for Ukraine as it is true for the fight against some of the extremist ideology and terrorism. There are some examples of official counter-speech which needs to be strengthened. And within the context of Ukraine and Russia in particular, it's essential that independent and diversity of voices reach out to the people. It's absolutely part of the fight, and it's a far more peaceful, effective, possibly effective tools. I'm not saying that arming others is not an option, but
I have her in the back of the room. No, back there, Annette, behind you.
Thanks a lot. Matthew Lee, Inner City Press. I'd heard, it was actually across the street, and I saw the webcast. I ran over here. I heard this reference to both, citizen journalists and the proliferation of the journalism profession. So I wanted to know whether the panelists think that online journalists and bloggers, for example, are given the same treatment both by sort of UN statements and by governments speaking out. I'm thinking specifically of there's something called the Free Zone 9 bloggers in Ethiopia who've been in jail on terrorism charge for some time. And I asked repeatedly if the Secretary General was going to say anything. He didn't, but he did speak in the case of Al Jazeera, much to his credit. But it's sort of like there's a UN office in Addis Ababa that hasn't spoken about these guys. And so I wonder, maybe the point of the question would be, does the UN itself, the Secretary itself, do enough to advance these principles of freedom of expression in cases other than the highest profile large media? Thanks a lot.
Who would like to take that question? Yes, go, David.
So thank you. As an independent journalist, it's good to see you here. So look, from different perspectives, I think that's right. Sometimes the way that the UN engages with governments isn't always apparent, and it's important for the UN in some situations to engage kind of publicly and loudly, and some situations might call for a little bit more of a quieter engagement. So from my perspective, from the UN, from the OHCHR, the High Commissioner for Human Rights Office, and the independent rapporteurs, that system of which I'm a part, we have different kinds of tools. Our first tool is to communicate with governments on the quiet side, right, to send them allegation letters or urgent appeals. Here's where we see a particular problem, Zone 9 bloggers being a very good example of that, and where we don't get a response or where it's actually urgent and it deals with situations of detention, to issue press releases and to really call out bad behavior. Does that always work? No. Certainly not, and probably less than 50-50 chance that we're going to get a good outcome out of those things. But I think it's absolutely important, so I agree with the tenor of your comment, which is, we should be out there calling out the bad behavior at the moment that it happens. Sometimes that means quietly, sometimes that means going more public. And the situation of the Zone 9 bloggers, again, is a very good example. And I think it's also important to recognize that Article 19 isn't written in such a way as to protect only journalists. I mean, it protects everyone protects everyone's right to seek, receive, and impart information. So that applies, to the blogger who, in that quintessential way is blogging in pajamas, all the way, to the person who's gathering information in the field. All of those individuals should be protected, and they should be protected, both quietly and loudly by those in the UN system.
Okay, let me just see hands again, because I may have a few. I've got 1, 2, 3. Let's take, Bill wants that? Okay, 4, Bill Blakemore. Let's take 4 questions at once now so we get them all in, and then we can answer them all at one time. Starting there. Yeah.
Rhonda Haubin, and I have a netizen blog at taz.de, which is die Tageszeitung website. And I'm a UN correspondent. And I have 2 questions. And one is about the reporting of the mainstream US and Western media about the weapons of mass destruction in the prelude leading up to the Iraq War. And there was a lot of criticism of that reporting, and a lot of it was based on defectors and government sources. And it seems that there was a sense there would be some change after that. But what have we seen after that? We've seen very similar kinds of activity, and one outstanding example is North Korea. Only the defectors essentially get any coverage. And the fact that South Korea doesn't allow there to be an understanding of what's going on in North Korea and a support for hearing and debate or discussion is never covered. And in general, there's a demonization of North Korea in general, of the people, of everything. But secondarily, so that's one. There was Libya, which got a very one-sided coverage in the mainstream media. So there's a whole set of things where it didn't seem the US media recognized that there was the need to have alternative narratives in the debate over them. And I guess I've gotten a little bit of the sense here that, in fact, there's a debate over what's going on in the Ukraine. That debate's very critical. So instead of putting it down, doesn't it have to be engaged? And the second piece of the question is, if you criticize the US position of anything at the UN, you don't get called on, essentially, if you criticize it from a perspective of a more peace perspective. And that's a similar thing that happens in general at the UN. And the press conferences get shorter, of the Security Council, for example. And so it's a very big problem of what we're facing. And I guess I wish there had been a broader perspective of looking at both the problem of how you are put down if you have a different viewpoint, and then secondarily, that how is the US media engaged that criticism. That was a very important criticism. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rhonda. Would you just keep that? We're going to take 4 at once. The second one, can you tell me who right here in the front row, in the second row. No, wait for the microphone.
Thank you.
And please identify yourself.
I'm Gloria Starkins, and I've been a diplomatic editor at the UN since 1957. I am referring to the minister I think he's very key in this, because where nobody in this room can talk to other ministers of information and to other governments, that would be impossible for us. He is in the in-group, and diplomacy is a club of foreign ministers and ministers of information. He can more or less sort out which countries are more open to any of the thoughts of this convention. That would be a very big help if then he, ear to ear, could discuss now with Mr. Hodge some of the questions at a follow-up would be logical that we really can do something about, and that where we can expect some kind of cooperation without dreaming.
Thank you, Laurie. Board, just keep that thought. We'll go on for 2 more questions. Can you remember? Yes.
Hi, my name is Marie. I work at the Coalition for the International Criminal Court. And I have a question regarding to what David Kay was saying about France, because I'm French myself. And my question is, France was criticized for not having enough regulations about the caricature for Mohammed. So I agree with you that there should not be regulations on freedom of expression, but is there a moral responsibility for the journalist not to say everything? So they have the right to say everything, but should they say everything?
Very good. And the fourth was Bill Blakemore, back for the second time. Go ahead.
Is it possible that our problem is still that the distinction between professional journalist and advocate or propagandist has still not been clearly enough delineated in anybody's mind? The difference between the media in general, who are guaranteed freedom of rights by the First Amendment and the 19th Article 19, and professional journalists, since historians like Michael Schudson and others have pointed out that the professionalization of professional journalism is very young. It's only about 100 years old, much younger than many other professions, and that we all still have a lot of work to do in distinguishing, as David Kay just indicated, between what is an advocate who deserves to be free and what is a professional journalist, someone who is perpetually and every moment skeptical of everything. Is that distinction, does it still need a lot of work?
I'm going to pass these out among our panelists. A couple were directed to individual people, but I think in the first question, I think, Matt, you wanted to respond to that, so would you start with that?
I'm not going to speak to the coverage of the lead up to the Iraq War. I was nowhere near Washington during that and nowhere near the New York Times. So I'm just going to, but I am going to say that to your other points about getting the other side of the story, look, we struggle in places where the other side is inherently hostile to get that side of the story. I have traveled to places that were probably, in retrospect, not the wisest decisions to try and meet Islamist militants in South Asia and elsewhere. I've had colleagues kidnapped doing the same thing. When the other side sees you as a target, either a valuable kidnapped chit or something to be killed, getting their side of the story is going to be difficult. There's just no way around it. You know, if I wanted, I cannot go to North Korea. This isn't South Korea's decision. This is North Korea's decision. So it's going to be difficult to get those sides of the stories. And, you know, you do your best to try and keep your reporting as balanced as you can. But when one side is happy to talk to you and the other side won't say a word, you know, the other side's going to get its narrative out. And this is true everywhere. I mean, I remember covering Afghanistan's presidential campaign, the crisis that followed. One of the candidates complained to me and a colleague that we were being too one-sided, and kind of frankly said to him, said, you know, your guys never answer the phone. So it's not that we're being one-sided, it's the other guy's getting his narrative out there. And that we're all fallible, we're not perfect. So.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And I'd also like to add that I think we have to be very careful of saying the American media. In no way can you put NPR and Fox in the same boat. And they're both mainstream. And even if you look at the run-up, the weapons of mass destruction, McClatchy News and New York Review of Books. Yeah, and I think you have to be really, really careful about that. Be very specific about which media, because different media have different access and they have different ways of approaching things. And just as a follow-up, I also wanted to talk about address Bill's question. Absolutely, the professionalization is not complete. It's an ever-evolving kinetic phenomenon, and I think it's had a setback with social media because, as I said before, anybody can go out and call themselves a journalist now without any formation. In our generation and before, you actually went through a system and you got minimal training, at least within your own organization. There are plenty of people just going out, hanging up a shingle, and they're journalists. And I think it's very problematic now, and it's endangering us more. Also, there's a lot of very unprofessional people doing unprofessional things. It's making the rest of us targets.
Board, could I ask you to talk about the diplomatic club that Laurie asked about and what its responsibilities are?
I appreciate that you say that I can fix this. I appreciate the confidence. We have put, I think, because we recognize that we are not moving in the right direction on this issue, on freedom of expression, on the protection of journalists. We are moving in the wrong direction. Therefore, we have put together a white paper in Norway, which we have sent to Parliament. We have made it with the contribution of civil society, tried to identify how can we do more to promote freedom of expression, to promote free media, to protect journalists. And I think there are several answers to that. One is to bring it up in conversation with other governments, and we do. And we must consistently do that. Secondly, I think we need to do it in multilateral forums. One of the good things about the UN Human Rights Council is the UPR hearings, where all countries are held responsible for what they are doing, and they need to listen, ask their questions, and listen to recommendations, and need to accept some, and they'll decline some, but to use that opportunity to give recommendations and to follow up on recommendations, particularly those that are accepted, to do it from our part, but also to do it from media and from civil society. This is what governments have said, that they will take upon themselves to improve. Then I think we have the responsibility to support civil society, because I don't think I can fix it alone. I think civil society are important in this regard. Then it's always a balance. Well, you need to think through when is naming and shaming and going public and criticizing the right approach? When is it to engage in a dialogue? And there might be different opinions on that. And my last point, perhaps, I attended this morning a panel put together by the government of Slovakia and South Africa on security sector reform, and to be able to develop a security sector that are able to protect civilians, including journalists, is part of what is necessary to protect freedom of expression. I don't know if that's the full answer, but I appreciate that you nodded during it.
David Kay, we were discussing beforehand the fact that the rapporteur for the Human Rights Council is not theoretically a UN person, but there was a question asked about UN information policies, and if you feel you could respond to it, that would be great. Okay. If you don't feel that, I will understand that you're not officially a UN person.
Well, I actually wanted to take, there were two other questions.
Well, take those two also.
I'll take the other two. One was Bill's question, sort of, are we distinguishing well enough between professional journalists and advocates? And I guess I want to take issue with one of the comments made before. I don't think citizen journalists, I don't think the internet, or maybe I should put it this way. I don't know if the kind of expansion of citizen journalism or blogging or posting on Facebook and all of that is making a job harder for professional journalists. What I do know is that from the perspective, and this may sound legalistic, but from the perspective of Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the UDHR, everyone has the right to seek, receive, impart information. The impart information does not limit itself to somebody who's professional, and I think it's really dangerous if we go down the road of talking about people who can share information who somehow have to be professional, board certified, or something like that. That's not the world we live in. That's not, I bet if we went around and saw, where do we all get our information? It's from individuals on Twitter. It's from people posting videos around the world. There's all sorts of ways to collect information, and granted, this panel is about protection of journalists, we should be thinking broadly about the protection of all of our freedom of expression and the sharing of information. I think that's really critical. Marie, you asked a really good question about sort of the moral responsibility of journalists. Maybe that might be another full panel. That would be a good way for me to get out of the question, to say that also. You know, I would defer to the journalists. I'd actually be really interested in how the professional journalists here think about those kinds of questions. You know, from my perspective, there's a line between outright mockery and argument. I don't know where that line is drawn, and I think that mockery sometimes, as satire, plays an important role in sparking discussion. So I think this, I can't really answer the question of moral responsibility, but I think every journalist has probably their own kind of conscience and has to think about first their self-protection and also the way in which, particularly if we're talking about satire and Charlie Hebdo, the reaction that people might have. But I don't think that is in any way grounds for limiting, as a legal matter, one's ability to say those or write those the kinds of things or draw them.
Okay, finally, and I told Agnès she shall have the last word.
Thank you. First, a quick follow-up to the question about France. I'm not sure I quite understood your question, because actually France has a great deal of regulation on content, far more than this country, for instance, that didn't reproduce the cartoon, and which would have been fully allowed in the United States, while there were some borderline cases in France. So it's not at all that France don't have regulation for. Please don't communicate that, because it's completely the opposite. We have a lot of content regulation, and in fact, as David was saying, it's increasing, and it's not increasing in the right direction at the moment. Second, I just wanted to talk a little bit about journalism versus propaganda and so on. 3 points. The first one is that we are living in an era where those categories are completely being redefined. And while international human rights law is very clear that there is no such thing as a professional journalist versus a non-professional, everyone is protected and they all have the right to impart and deliver and communicate information. At national level, the fight is on, particularly here in the US, where a couple of laws and amendments are being discussed under access to information and various laws. And one of the key issues that is driving the debate and, in fact, impeding the outcome of the process is what is a journalist and what is information. In other parts of the world, one of the key discussions is around what is a media and what is a publisher. There is a very big case at the European Court at the moment as to whether or not a website that publishes that is content-driven, whose content is being produced by its users, whether that amounts to a publisher or a media. And there are several similar debates around ISPs. So we are living in an era where all those concepts are completely being redefined. And I think we may not be in a position where we can come up with very firm definition, at least just now. Second, I think your question around professional journalism versus propaganda, to me, was a bit Anglo-Saxon, which is not a reproach, but I think that in other parts of the world, journalists may be a little bit more skeptical about how their work differ from taking a stand or taking a position. And as you know, there is still a lot of debate probably within the US as well as to, you know, the objective journalism as versus the journalists that take a side. So that's also something that I would like to just put on the table to just make the discussion a bit more complex. But thirdly, I think ultimately what we're looking for is diversity and pluralism. So personally, I don't care whether you take a stand or you don't. What I want to know is whether you do, and I want to be able to access any of you. And I want to be able to access a range of media, a range of perspective, a range of type of journalism, whether it's online, offline, taking side, not taking side. And that's the role of the government. It is about protecting an environment where this diversity and this pluralism can flourish, and where as a reader, as a listener, as a viewer, I can access them all. Thank you.
That's a wonderful summary of what we've been talking about. And I want to say that I, for one, have learned an awful lot just being up on this table listening to these panelists. That is a tribute to their candor and their being very well informed and very articulate. So first of all, I want to thank them, the panel. You were terrific. And thank you all for your good questions and attention.